I was standing in the hallway outside our bedroom, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea, when I heard my wife say the sentence that ended our marriage 6 months before either of us admitted it out loud. She needs her real parents this year, Mom. Not. I mean, obviously not instead of Nate, just in addition. He'll understand. He always understands. A pause. Then, quieter, almost apologetic. He's not going, no. It's just going to be complicated with him there. You know how it gets when the bonus dad tries to keep up with Preston. The bonus dad. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. 2 mugs of tea slowly losing their heat in my hands. Listening to my wife of 9 years describe me to her mother using a phrase you'd use for a coupon at a grocery store. Something extra. Something that came free with the real purchase. Not essential. I didn't say anything that night. I set both mugs down on the hallway console table, quietly, the way you set down something you're afraid of breaking, and I went downstairs to my study and sat in the dark for 2 hours. Somewhere around midnight, I opened my laptop, pulled up an email I'd left unanswered for 11 days, and typed 4 words to a man named Julian Farrow at Ashcombe Whitfield Engineering Group in London. I'll take the position. Then I closed the laptop, and for the first time in 9 years, I slept in the guest room without telling my wife why. My name is Nathaniel Calloway. Nate, to almost everyone, though my mother still calls me Nathaniel when she's proud of me, which is often because I built something out of nothing and she never lets me forget it. I'm 48 years old. I'm the founder and principal of Calloway Structural, a firm that designs and engineers landmark bridges, marine terminals, and long-span structures. The kind of buildings people photograph from the water, the kind that end up on postcards without anyone knowing the name of the man who made sure they wouldn't fall down. I grew up the son of a welder in Norfolk, Virginia, in a house where engineer sounded like a word from another planet. My father, Earl, worked the shipyards for 31 years, came home every night smelling of metal and machine oil, and never once in his life owned a suit that wasn't for a funeral. He was proud of me in the quiet, awkward way men of his generation express pride. A firm handshake instead of a hug, a good muttered over the newspaper when I told him about a new project, a framed photo of my first bridge that he kept on the mantel and never once mentioned to me directly, though my mother told me he showed it to every plumber, electrician, and delivery driver who ever set foot in that house. I put myself through school on scholarships and a part-time job inspecting scaffolding on construction sites, learning the discipline that would define the rest of my career. You check the load-bearing elements first, always, before you worry about how anything looks. By 36, I designed my first cable-stayed bridge. I remember standing on that bridge the morning it opened to traffic, watching the first cars cross a span I'd spent 2 years calculating down to the millimeter and feeling, for the first time in my adult life, entirely certain of something. By 42, Calloway Structural had offices in Charleston, Houston, and Singapore. I owned 3 suits that cost more than my father's first truck, and I still, to this day, can't walk past a construction site without stopping to look at the rebar. People who meet me at conferences assume a certain kind of story: old money, prep school, a name that opens doors before I've said a word. It's not that story. Everything I have, I built with my hands, and a stubborn refusal to accept that's not how it's done as an answer. I mention this not out of vanity, but because it matters later, because the family I married into came from a very different story, one where the name opened the doors, and they never quite forgave me for building my own set of doors instead of waiting to be let through theirs. My father died 4 years ago, before any of this happened, and I think about him often in the middle of this story, because he never once, in 71 years, set anyone down and explained what it meant to be a good man. He just was one, quietly, every single day, in a way that only became fully visible to me after he was gone, and I started noticing all the small structural things he'd held up without ever asking for credit. I think that's where I learned to do the same thing, for better and eventually, painfully, for worse. I met Claire at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital 11 years ago. She was 31, recently divorced, raising a 4-year-old daughter named Zoe on her own after her first husband, a commercial real estate broker named Preston Vance, left them both. Not dramatically, not with some scandalous affair, just quietly, the way some men leave. Fewer calls, fewer visits, a slow fade until the child support checks became the only proof he still existed. Claire was warm and sharp and funny in a way that undid me completely within 20 minutes of conversation. I remember she spilled red wine on my sleeve apologizing for laughing too hard at something I'd said, and I told her not to worry about it, because I'd apparently decided somewhere in those 20 minutes that I was going to marry her. Zoe, 4 years old that night, was asleep at home with a babysitter, and Claire kept glancing at her phone every 20 minutes to check on her, which I found, even then, more attractive than anything else about her. A woman entirely unwilling to let a good conversation make her forget the small person depending on her. She was cautious with me at first, in a way I understood completely once I got to know her family better. She'd already been left once by a man who looked good on paper, and she wasn't in a hurry to hand her daughter's heart to another one. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, slowly, deliberately, the way I approach every major structural decision, testing the load at every stage before adding the next beam. I didn't rush Zoe, either. I let her come to me. I built her a tree house the summer she turned 6, not because anyone asked me to, but because I remembered my own father building me one out of scrap lumber from the shipyard, and I wanted her to have something that felt like it was made specifically for her, by someone who'd chosen to be there. Zoe was 5 when Claire and I got married. I didn't try to replace Preston. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to how this story unfolds. I never once told Zoe to call me Dad. She started doing it on her own, around age 7. After I spent 4 consecutive Saturdays teaching her to ride a bike in the church parking lot near our first house. And one afternoon she just looked up at me, scraped knee and all, and said, "Thanks, Dad," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I had to walk into the garage afterward and stand very still for a while, because a 40-year-old man crying over a bicycle lesson is not something I was prepared to explain to the neighbors. I paid for that house. Bought it outright 2 years into our marriage, put it entirely in my name on the advice of my attorney, which felt cold and clinical at the time and which I would come to be enormously grateful for later. I paid for Zoe's private school, her braces, her summer camps, the used but pristine Jeep we gave her for her 16th birthday, which was actually leased through my company for tax reasons, a detail nobody in that family ever cared to understand until it mattered enormously. Claire, at her own choosing, stopped working full-time when Zoe was 9 to focus on her painting and volunteer work, something I supported completely and never once resented, because that's what partnership means to me. I built the floor everyone stood on. I never once asked anybody to thank me for it. What I didn't fully understand, for longer than I'd like to admit, was how Claire's family felt about that floor, and about the man who'd built it. Claire's mother, Diane Whitmore, comes from what the Low Country calls an old name. 3 generations of Charleston real estate money, a family crest on the good silver, the kind of pedigree that gets discussed at length at dinner parties without anyone ever quite saying the word money out loud. Diane was polite to me for 11 years in the specific way people are polite to a caterer they've hired for an event. Pleasant, correct, never once warm. She referred to me, in the early years, as Claire's husband, which I found oddly formal until I realized, much later, that she was deliberately avoiding the word son-in-law, because that word implied a permanence she wasn't sure she wanted to grant me. At our wedding reception, in fact, Diane gave a toast that I still think about. She talked at length about Claire's resilience, about how proud the family was that Claire had found stability again, and then, raising her glass toward me almost as an afterthought, said, "And to Nathaniel, for stepping in when it counted." Stepping in, like I was a substitute teacher covering someone else's classroom, temporarily useful, ultimately replaceable the moment the real teacher returned. Preston Vance, meanwhile, spent the first 6 years of Zoe's life mostly absent. A birthday call here, a Christmas gift shipped a week late there, a man building his own career in commercial real estate in Atlanta and, from what I understood, working through 2 subsequent relationships that didn't leave much room for a daughter 3 states away. I didn't hate him for it. Genuinely. I thought, for years, that his absence was simply a sad, ordinary kind of failure, the kind you feel sorry for rather than angry about. Then, about 18 months before that night in the hallway, Preston sold his brokerage to a national firm for what Claire described to me, wide-eyed, as an absolutely obscene amount of money, and something in the entire architecture of our family quietly, invisibly began to shift. The first sign was small enough that I nearly missed it. Zoe's 14th birthday, a dinner at Diane's house on the Battery, the kind of house with a widow's walk and a portrait of a Confederate-era ancestor nobody quite wants to talk about at the top of the stairs. Preston flew in for it. First time he'd come to a birthday in person in 3 years, with a gift-wrapped box the size of a dishwasher that turned out to contain a full recording studio setup for Zoe's bedroom, because he'd apparently heard, secondhand, that she liked music. I'd been the one driving her to guitar lessons every Tuesday for 6 years. I knew she liked music. I also knew, watching her open that box with wide, thrilled eyes, that this wasn't really about music. This was a man buying back 6 years of absence in one afternoon, and doing it very effectively, because 14-year-olds are not immune to the specific magic of a parent who suddenly shows up rich and apologetic and interesting. Diane, watching from the head of the table, said, loud enough for the room, "Isn't it wonderful, having Zoe's real family all in one place?" She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I let it go. I told myself grandmothers say strange things, that old wounds about the divorce probably still lingered for her, that I didn't need to make an issue out of a sentence. I've since learned that letting it go is a skill I'm entirely too good at, the same way a load-bearing wall lets everything above it go without complaint, right up until the day it can't anymore. Over the following year, the pattern repeated with a rhythm I could set a watch to. Preston started calling more. Preston started visiting more. Every visit accompanied by something expensive, a designer bag for Claire's birthday, a European ski trip proposed, just because we never got to do that as a family. Always phrased with just enough ambiguity about which family he meant. At a 4th of July gathering at Diane's beach house, Preston made a toast to getting back the years we lost, raised his glass to Zoe, then to Claire, and, after a beat that felt deliberately calculated, added, and to Nate, for holding things together while I figured myself out. Everyone laughed warmly. I smiled and raised my glass, and underneath the smile I understood, with total clarity, that I had just been thanked for babysitting someone else's family for a decade. Claire started spending more time on the phone with Preston, coordinating about Zoe's schedule, which made sense on its face. Divorced co-parents coordinate. That's normal. That's healthy. I never once objected to that. What I noticed instead was smaller and harder to name. The way Claire started mentioning Preston's opinions on things that had nothing to do with logistics. Preston thinks Zoe should consider boarding school. Preston thinks we're being too soft about her phone use. Preston thinks. A man who'd been a Christmas card presence for a decade was suddenly weighing in on parenting decisions with the confidence of someone who'd been there every night. And Claire, to my quiet astonishment, kept giving that opinion more and more room at our table. I asked her about it once, gently, over dinner. "You've been quoting Preston a lot lately." She looked genuinely surprised. "Have I?" I hadn't noticed. It wasn't defensiveness in her voice. It was genuine blindness, the kind that only comes from being slowly, patiently conditioned not to see a pattern while it's forming. That, more than anything else, worried me. Not that it was happening, but that she couldn't see it happening. "I want to be honest about something here," because this story only works if I am. I am not a naturally emotionally articulate man. I run a company with 400 employees. I can stand in front of a city council and defend a 9-figure bridge design without breaking a sweat. But sitting across from my wife and saying, out loud, I feel like I'm being slowly written out of my own family. That particular sentence I could not make myself say for almost a full year because some old, stubborn part of me believed that a real man doesn't complain about not feeling appreciated. He just keeps building. He just keeps paying the mortgage and driving to guitar lessons and hoping the foundation holds itself together through sheer will. Foundations don't work that way. I know that better than almost anyone alive, and I still, somehow, forgot it when it came to my own life. Around this same time, my own mother, visiting from Norfolk for a weekend, watched Diane's family orbit shift over the course of a single Sunday dinner and pulled me aside afterward in the kitchen. That woman doesn't think you're family, Nathaniel, she said bluntly, drying a dish with more force than the dish required. She thinks you're the help who happens to be married to her daughter. I told her she was overreacting, the same thing I'd been telling myself for a year. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was 9 years old and insisting I hadn't broken the neighbor's window. You've always been a terrible liar to yourself, honey. You're an excellent liar to everyone else. Just never to yourself, until now, apparently. I didn't sleep well that night. My mother has never once been wrong about anything that mattered. The trip that finally broke everything open was supposed to be 2 weeks in the south of France. Diane's 70th birthday, an entire extended family affair at a villa Preston had rented, his gift to the family. A phrase that had started appearing in every sentence about him lately, as though generosity were a personality trait rather than a thing anyone with sufficient money can perform. I'd cleared my calendar for it. I'd bought Zoe a set of watercolors I knew she'd love for the trip, packed away in tissue paper in my study for 3 weeks before I heard that hallway phone call. She needs her real parents this year. He's not going. It's just going to be complicated with him there. The bonus dad. I lay awake most of that night doing the thing engineers do instinctively under stress. I ran the load calculations. Not on a bridge. On my marriage. 9 years of income, all of it mine. The house, in my name. The car Zoe drove, leased through my company. The health insurance covering all 3 of us, mine. The tuition, mine. The trip they were about to take without me, funded partly by Preston's new fortune and partly, I suspected, by the credit card that was still, technically, on my account. I am not a vindictive man. I want that understood clearly before I tell you what I did next, because what I did next could easily be mistaken for spite, and it wasn't. It was the oldest instinct I have, the one that built a career out of understanding exactly how much weight a structure can bear before it needs to be redesigned from the foundation up. When something isn't holding, you don't scream at it. You quietly, carefully, remove your support and see what's actually standing on its own. The London position had been sitting in my inbox for 11 days. Ashcombe Whitfield Engineering Group, one of the most prestigious infrastructure firms in Europe, wanted me to head their North American and transatlantic projects division. Based in London, minimum 18-month commitment, the kind of role that ends careers in one direction or launches them into an entirely new stratosphere in the other. I'd been putting off the answer because Claire and I had agreed, years earlier, that we wouldn't uproot Zoe during high school for anything short of an emergency. That night, standing in the hallway with 2 cooling mugs of chamomile tea, I decided this qualified. I emailed Julian Farrow at midnight. By 6 a.m. Charleston time, he'd called me personally, thrilled, and we'd agreed on a start date 8 weeks out. I told Claire over breakfast, in the same calm, level voice I used to deliver bad news to city councils. I've accepted the London position. I leave in 8 weeks. She stared at me like I'd switched languages mid-sentence. What? Nate, we talked about this. We agreed we wouldn't. We agreed on a lot of things, I said, and I want to be clear, my voice never rose, not once, through this entire conversation. I heard you on the phone with your mother last week. I know I'm not going to France. I understand why. I think it's time I stop being the bonus feature in a family that's already decided who the real parents are. Claire went very pale. Nate, that's not. I didn't mean it like that. That was just a stupid thing to say to my mother. You know how she gets. I know exactly how she gets, I said. I've known for 11 years. I let it go every single time because I thought loving Zoe meant absorbing whatever her family thought of me without complaint. I was wrong. I think loving her means I'm allowed to have a limit too. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant in that moment. I didn't. I felt like a building coming down in a controlled demolition, deliberate, planned, and still, somehow, devastating to watch happen, even when you're the one who set the charges. What happened over the following 3 weeks is the part of this story I'm least proud of feeling good about, and also the part that changed everything. My oldest friend, Harlan Ruiz, has been my personal attorney and, more importantly, my closest confidant since business school. Harlan is the kind of man who reads a contract the way other men read the sports page, for pleasure, thoroughly, twice. When I told him what was happening, over whiskey on my back deck 2 nights after the London announcement, he went very quiet in a way I recognized from 20 years of watching him process something before he says it out loud. Nate, he said finally, I think there's more going on here than a grandmother who never liked you very much. What do you mean? I mean, Preston Vance sold his brokerage for $11 million 18 months ago, and I've watched this man materialize back into your family's life with suspicious timing and suspiciously specific opinions about how Zoe should be raised. Men who abandon their kids for a decade don't usually come back because they've had a moral awakening. They come back because something changed for them. I want to know what. I told him he was being paranoid. He told me to let him be paranoid for 2 weeks and see what turned up. I agreed, mostly because I was too exhausted, at that point, to argue with anyone about anything. Harlan started with the easy things: public filings on the sale of Preston's brokerage, property records, a review of Preston's social media presence going back 3 years, looking for the seam where the pattern of his absence turned into the pattern of his sudden, expensive reappearance. Then he brought in a private investigator he'd used before, a careful, quiet man named Otis Bramwell, who specialized in exactly the kind of financial and relational archaeology this situation required. Otis worked the way I imagine good engineers work, methodically, without drama, building his case one verified fact at a time rather than jumping to conclusions. He confirmed the sale of Preston's brokerage through public filings. He traced a pattern of credit card charges at a jewelry store in Buckhead, Atlanta, dated 4 months before the dinner, followed 6 weeks later by an engagement announcement buried in the back pages of a regional business magazine's society section, the kind of announcement nobody outside a very specific social circle would ever stumble across by accident. Harlan showed it to me on his laptop at my kitchen table, a small blurry photo of Preston and a woman I'd never met, both smiling, an engagement ring catching the camera flash. This was announced 4 months ago, Harlan said quietly, and he's been in your family's group text the entire time, talking about villas in France. 2 weeks turned into 3. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening while I was packing boxes for London, Harlan called and asked if he could come by in person instead of talking on the phone. That, more than anything he'd said so far, told me how bad it was going to be. What Harlan found, working quietly through public records, Otis's discreet legwork, and, eventually, damningly, Claire's own laptop, which she left open on the kitchen counter one evening while Zoe and I were at a guitar recital, was not the story any of us expected. Preston Vance was not, as it turned out, a reformed father experiencing a late-blooming devotion to his daughter. Preston Vance was engaged, quietly, to a woman in Atlanta named Renee Cho, engaged for 4 months, in fact, a fact he had shared with no one in Claire's family. What he had shared, in a long, warm, increasingly intimate string of text messages Harlan's investigator uncovered through entirely legal, publicly discoverable channels tied to a joint parenting app both Claire and Preston used to coordinate Zoe's schedule, was something else entirely, directed at Claire. I made a huge mistake leaving. I think about what we could have had all the time. Zoe deserves to see her parents together again, don't you think? I know you're married, but marriages end, Claire. Mine's about to. He hadn't told his fiancée he was calling off the engagement. He hadn't told Claire he was still engaged to someone else while writing her messages like that. What he had done, methodically, over 18 months, using his newfound money and his sudden, performative devotion to a daughter he'd ignored for a decade, was position himself to walk back into a family he'd once abandoned, not primarily for Zoe, though I believe some genuine remorse was tangled up in it somewhere, but for Claire and for the life he'd have to himself, entirely. If the man who'd spent 9 years quietly funding and holding that life together simply removed himself from the equation, the France trip wasn't a family reunion. It was, Harlan's evidence suggested, meant to be the setting for exactly that. 2 weeks in a villa, Diane's blessing already secured, Zoe primed by 18 months of expensive gifts and flattering attention to see her biological father as the hero of the story, and me, conveniently, uninvited. I sat at my kitchen table with that folder of printed messages for a very long time. I didn't feel rage, not at first. I felt something colder and more familiar. The specific, focused stillness of an engineer who has just found the structural flaw that was going to bring the whole building down and understands, with total clarity, exactly what needs to happen next. I didn't confront Claire privately. I want to explain why, because I know it will sound calculated, and it was, deliberately so. Claire's family operates, and always has, on the principle that unpleasant truths get discussed quietly, behind closed doors, managed and softened until they disappear entirely into the family's preferred version of events. Diane had spent 11 years managing me into a footnote using exactly that method. Small comments at dinner, never confronted, never apologized for, simply repeated until they calcified into accepted fact. I understood, watching that pattern for over a decade, that a private conversation with Claire would become, within a week, a story Diane told at her next luncheon about how Nate had one of his moods, or Nate never did handle change well. I needed a room this family couldn't quietly edit afterward. Diane's 70th birthday celebration, the same one meant to be a France trip that I'd very deliberately, financially, made impossible to fund once the London relocation pulled my income and the company car out of the household in one clean motion, got scaled back, in the scramble that followed, to a large dinner at Diane's Charleston house instead. 40 guests. Preston flew in. I was invited, out of what I suspect was Claire's guilt and Diane's desire to keep appearances intact in front of her social circle, and I accepted, because Harlan's folder was sitting in my briefcase, and I had finally found my room. The days leading up to the dinner were strange, suspended, both of us moving through the house like careful strangers, Claire clearly sensing something had shifted without knowing exactly what, me saying nothing, packing the last of my things into crates bound for a storage unit, and, eventually, a container ship. Zoe noticed the tension too, in the particular way teenagers notice everything while pretending to notice nothing, spending more time in her room, texting friends instead of coming down for dinner, once asking me directly, "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" I told her the truth, the only truth I actually had at that point. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But whatever happens with your mom and me, nothing about you and me is changing. I promise you that." She didn't fully believe me. I didn't blame her. Promises from adults had not, in her limited experience of the men in this family, historically held up well under pressure. The dinner unfolded exactly the way these dinners always do in that family. Expensive wine, careful conversation, Diane holding court at the head of the table describing, at length, How wonderful it's been having Preston back in our lives. Truly, Zoe's never been happier. Preston sat beside Claire, not beside his own daughter, a detail I don't think anyone but me registered at the time. He wore a watch I recognized as costing roughly 4 times what my own did, and told a long, self-deprecating story about a failed golf outing that had the whole table laughing. Diane loudest of all, her hand resting fondly on his forearm at one point in a gesture I don't believe she'd ever once extended to me in 11 years. I waited until dessert, the way I've learned to wait for the exact moment in a negotiation when a room is settled enough to actually hear you. Then I stood. I want to say something, if that's all right, I said, and the table quieted the way rooms do when a man who rarely speaks up decides to speak. I've spent 9 years in this family. I built the house Zoe grew up in. I drove her to guitar lessons every Tuesday for 6 years. I've never once asked to be called her real father, because I never needed the word to know what I was to her. But I was recently told, by my own wife, that I wasn't among Zoe's real parents, and I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking very hard about what that word actually means in this family. Diane's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Claire went white. So I did what I do for a living, I continued. I investigated the load-bearing structure. And I found something I think everyone at this table should probably know before you all get on a plane to France together as one big, happy, reunited family. I opened the folder. I didn't read every message aloud. I'm not a cruel man, and Claire didn't deserve total public humiliation for having been targeted by someone skilled at exactly this kind of manipulation. But I read enough. I read the line about the engagement Preston hadn't told anyone about. I read the line about marriages ending. I read the date stamps that placed these messages squarely across the same 18 months everyone at that table had been celebrating as Preston's redemption. The silence that followed was the kind I imagine happens right before a structure fails. Total, suspended, everyone waiting to see which direction the collapse will go. This is insane, Preston said, standing so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Claire, he's clearly desperate. He's about to lose you. Of course he'd fabricate something like this. I didn't fabricate a fiancée in Atlanta named Renee Cho, I said quietly. You did. 4 months ago. Should we call her Preston? I have her number too. Preston did not have an answer for that. He tried, weakly, to pivot toward outrage, insisting the messages were taken out of context, that co-parents talk about all kinds of things, that I was a bitter man about to lose his marriage and grasping for any weapon available. Nobody at the table was buying it anymore, and I think he knew that faster than anyone, because men who build their entire identity on charm know exactly the moment a room stops extending them the benefit of the doubt. Diane, whose face had gone through several distinct emotional stages in under a minute, settled finally on something that looked almost like recognition. The specific, sickening recognition of a woman realizing she'd spent 18 months championing a man who'd been quietly working to dismantle her daughter's marriage while she cheered him on. Preston, she said, very quietly, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Is there a woman in Atlanta? He didn't answer fast enough. That was the answer. Zoe, sitting near the end of the table, looked back and forth between the 3 adults who had, between them, spent the last year and a half rearranging her entire understanding of her family without once asking what she actually wanted. Then she looked at me. Really looked, the way she had that afternoon in the church parking lot, scraped knee, 8 years old, deciding on her own that I was her father. Is this true? She asked Preston directly. Her voice didn't shake. He didn't answer that fast enough either. One of Diane's oldest friends, a woman named Cordelia Ashworth who had known Claire since she was in diapers, set down her wine glass and said, into the silence, well, I think that answers that, doesn't it? It wasn't unkind, exactly, but it was final, the way a jury foreman's voice is final. And something about hearing it from someone outside the immediate family seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the room in place. Preston left the dinner within 10 minutes, muttering something about how everyone was overreacting, grabbing his jacket off the back of his chair with the particular clumsy urgency of a man who understands, suddenly, that the room he's standing in no longer belongs to him. I watched Diane's carefully constructed evening collapse in real time, guests quietly excusing themselves in twos and threes, the way people do when they've witnessed something they weren't supposed to see and don't yet know what to do with it. Claire didn't say anything to me at the table. She followed me out to my car afterward, in the dark, mascara streaked, and said only, "How long have you known?" 3 weeks, I said. About Preston. I've known about not feeling wanted here for a lot longer than that. I drove home alone that night. I still left for London on schedule, 8 weeks later, exactly as planned. Some collapses, once they've started, don't stop just because the room finally understood the truth. The months that followed were the hardest of my adult life, harder, in some ways, than building a company from nothing, because a company failing is a problem you can solve with strategy. A marriage unraveling in slow motion across an ocean is not something spreadsheets fix. I moved into a flat in Marylebone that October, gray London mornings, a city that felt enormous and entirely indifferent to the fact that my life had just come apart at the exact moment my career was accelerating into its most significant chapter. The Ashcombe Whitfield office overlooked the Thames, and I remember standing at the window my first week, watching barges move slowly under Blackfriars Bridge, thinking about how strange it was that I could still find real, uncomplicated joy in a well-designed structure, while everything about my personal life felt like a demolition site. I threw myself into the work the way I'd once thrown myself into Callaway Structural in my 30s. Long hours, complicated bridge projects across 3 countries, the particular numbness of being extraordinarily good at your job while being quietly devastated in every other part of your life. Claire and I spoke by phone every few days at first, careful, formal conversations mostly about logistics, Zoe's school schedule, whether I'd call for her birthday, who was handling the property taxes on the house I still owned outright and had, despite everything, no interest in taking from either of them. I want to be honest, some part of me, the vindictive part one trying not to indulge, considered it. My attorney gently reminded me I was entirely within my rights to. I told him I'd rather sleep at night than win a war I never actually wanted to start. Zoe called more than Claire did. She was 15 by then, going through the particular fury and clarity 15-year-olds sometimes get about the adults who failed them, and she was, unsparingly, furious at her grandmother, at Preston, and, to my surprise, at her own mother, in a way I gently tried to soften without excusing what had happened. She let him say all that stuff about you for a year, Zoe told me over a crackling video call one November evening. She never once told him to stop. Your mom was dealing with a lot, I said, which was true, and also, I recognized even as I said it, the exact kind of quiet absorption of other people's failures that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. I was working on it. Slowly. Some evenings that autumn, sitting alone in my Marylebone flat with a glass of wine and a stack of structural reports I didn't have the energy to actually read, I found myself replaying 11 years of dinners, holidays, small comments I'd absorbed without complaint, trying to identify the exact moment I'd started believing that my own comfort was the acceptable cost of everyone else's. I couldn't find one single moment. It was never one moment. That's the part nobody warns you about. Erosion doesn't announce itself with a single dramatic event. It just quietly removes a little more of the foundation every year until one phone call in a hallway finally reveals how much is already washed away. That first Christmas in London, I spent the day alone, which I want to be honest about, because I think these stories sometimes skip over the genuinely lonely parts in a rush to get to the redemption. I bought a small tree from a stand near Regent's Park, strung it with lights I found at a hardware store, and video called Zoe for 2 hours while she opened presents 6 time zones away, watching her face on a laptop screen instead of across a living room. My mother called from Norfolk that evening, and when I told her, honestly, that it had been a hard day, she didn't try to fix it or minimize it. She just stayed on the phone with me for another hour, telling me stories about my father I'd never heard before, and at the end of the call she said, "You built a whole company out of nothing, Nathaniel. You'll build this back too, if it's worth building. And if it's not, you'll build something else. That's just who you are." I fell asleep on the couch that night with the tree lights still on, and woke up the next morning feeling, for the first time in months, something close to steady. Diane, to her credit, and I never expected to type that sentence about Diane Whitmore, called me herself in December, the first time she'd ever initiated a phone call to me in 11 years of knowing her. She didn't apologize outright. Women of her generation and upbringing rarely do, directly. What she said instead was, "I've been reconsidering some things about this past year, Nathaniel," using my full name, the way my own mother does when she's being serious. "I think I owe you a more careful conversation than a phone call. When you're back in the country," she told me, in that same call, about her own father, a man, it turned out, who had raised her stepbrother without ever once distinguishing between real and step, and how she'd somehow, over the decades, let that lesson slip through her fingers when it came to her own daughter's marriage. "I think I was so relieved Claire had someone from our world back in the picture that I stopped asking myself whether that someone was actually good for her," she said. "That's on me, not on you." It was the closest thing to genuine self-examination I'd ever heard from Diane Whitmore, and I sat with the phone pressed to my ear for a long moment after she said it, not entirely sure how to respond to 11 years of quiet condescension finally, unexpectedly, softening into something honest. The real turning point came in February, 5 months after London, in the form of a long email from Claire, not a text, not a phone call, a genuine letter, written carefully, the kind of writing that takes several drafts. She admitted, in painful detail, how thoroughly Preston's return had disoriented her, not because she'd stopped loving me, she wrote, but because 18 months of a charming, wealthy, suddenly attentive ex-husband combined with her own mother's relentless preference for him had created a kind of fog she hadn't recognized she was standing in until I'd cleared it in one devastating dinner-table sentence. I told myself I was protecting Zoe's relationship with her biological father, she wrote. I didn't let myself see that I was doing it by slowly erasing the father who'd actually shown up every single day for 9 years. I called you the bonus dad because some small, ugly part of me had absorbed my mother's idea that blood was the only thing that made a parent real. I am so ashamed of how long it took me to reject that idea out loud. I read that letter probably a dozen times over the following week, in my too-quiet flat in Marylebone, London rain against the windows. I didn't write back for 11 days. I've learned, over the years, that the right answer rarely arrives on the same day as the wound that requires it. When I did write back, I told her the truth, the whole truth, the way I wished I'd been telling it for the past decade, instead of quietly absorbing every small diminishment as the cost of belonging to her family. I told her I forgave the fog. Genuinely, I do. But that I couldn't forgive or forget how long it had taken her to see me clearly again once the fog lifted. I told her I wasn't sure, yet, what that meant for us. I told her I was sure, completely, about what it meant for Zoe, that nothing about my relationship to her would ever be contingent on whether her mother and I found our way back to each other. We didn't rush anything after that. I want to be honest about that, too, because I think these stories sometimes promise a tidier ending than real life actually offers. Claire and I talked, slowly, over months, first as co-parents figuring out shared custody logistics across an ocean, then, gradually, as two people cautiously testing whether there was still something worth rebuilding underneath everything that had cracked. She flew to London that spring, alone, for 4 days, the first time either of us had been in the same room since the dinner table in Charleston. We didn't resolve everything in those 4 days. We didn't need to. We just, finally, said the true things out loud instead of managing around them, which was the entire skill I'd never learned in 9 years of marriage and had been forced, by circumstance, to finally practice. We walked along the South Bank on her last evening, past the Globe Theater and the food stalls under Southwark Bridge, and she asked me, quietly, whether I thought we could actually get back what we'd had before Preston came back into the picture. I told her the truth, because I'd promised myself, standing in that hallway with 2 mugs of cooling tea, that I would never again choose comfortable silence over honesty. I don't think we get back what we had, I said. I think, if we're lucky, we build something sturdier than what we had, because now we both know exactly where the weak points were. She cried a little at that, and laughed a little too, and said it sounded like something I'd say about a bridge instead of a marriage. I told her that was probably fair, and that I'd stopped apologizing years ago for the fact that I understand love the same way I understand load-bearing structures. You don't get to skip the inspection just because the building looks nice from the street. Zoe came to visit me in London that July, her first time on an international flight without her mother, 16 years old and fiercely, visibly proud of herself for navigating Heathrow alone. We spent 10 days walking the city, and on the 4th night, sitting on the steps outside the Tate Modern watching the Thames go gold in the evening light, she asked me, out of nowhere, "Are you and Mom going to get back together?" "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "But I want you to know something regardless of how that turns out. You were never the reason any of this happened, and you'll never be the reason it doesn't get fixed. I'm your dad." That part was never actually in question, not for me. It just took your family a while to remember that blood isn't the only thing that holds a house up. She leaned her head against my shoulder, the same way she used to as a little girl falling asleep in the car after guitar lessons, and didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Preston, for what it's worth, quietly disappeared from the family's orbit within a few months of that dinner. Renee Cho, it turned out, had called off their engagement herself the week after learning about the messages. Harlan's investigator, thorough to a fault, had apparently sent her the same folder, a decision I neither authorized nor, if I'm honest, regretted once I learned about it. Preston sent Zoe 2 birthday texts the following year and then stopped altogether. I've come to believe some men only ever wanted the idea of a family reunion, never the daily, unglamorous work of actually building one. The guitar lessons, the scraped knees, the 11 years of showing up when nothing about it was interesting or rewarding, just necessary. I finished my 18-month contract in London that following spring. Ashcombe Whitfield offered to extend it permanently, with a significant promotion attached. I turned it down. I'd built an entire company, once, on the belief that you go where the work needs you most, and by then, I understood, with total structural clarity, exactly where that was. I moved back to Charleston. Claire and I didn't remarry immediately, and I want to be careful here, because I think that detail matters more than a tidy Hollywood ending would suggest. We dated again, slowly, like 2 people who'd learned the hard way not to build anything on a foundation they hadn't actually inspected first. We went to counseling together, something neither of us had done in 9 years of marriage, meeting twice a week for 4 months in a small beige office that started to feel more like a job site than a therapist's practice. Our counselor, a measured, unflappable woman named Dr. Anita Roswell, pointed out something in our 3rd session that I've turned over in my mind many times since. That I had built an entire career around identifying exactly how much weight a structure could bear before failure, and had somehow never once applied that same diagnostic instinct to my own emotional load. "You inspect bridges for a living," she said. "You never once inspected yourself." Claire, for her part, did the harder work of examining why her mother's approval had carried so much structural weight in her own decision-making for most of her adult life. Work that had nothing to do with me directly, and everything to do with why I'd been so easy to quietly diminish in the first place. We're engaged again now, as I tell you this, 18 months after that dinner table in Charleston. Diane, to everyone's genuine astonishment, hosted the engagement party herself and made a toast. A real one. No qualifiers, no careful distancing language. To my daughter, and to Nathaniel, Zoe's father, who I owe an apology I intend to keep paying off for a very long time. She's kept that promise more consistently than I expected. She calls me now, not often, but genuinely, to ask about work, about my own aging mother in Norfolk, about nothing in particular. The ordinary, unremarkable calls that are, I've come to understand, exactly what belonging is supposed to sound like. Last month, she called just to ask my opinion on a bridge she'd seen photographed in a travel magazine, and I found myself explaining cable-stayed tension loads to a 71-year-old Charleston socialite for 20 minutes, both of us laughing by the end at how far we'd come from Claire's husband and stepping in when it counted. Zoe is 17 now, applying to engineering schools of her own, a fact that undoes me completely every time I think about it. She toured Callaway Structural's Charleston office last spring and stood in front of a scale model of a bridge I designed a decade before she was born and told me, very seriously, that she wanted to design something that would still be standing 100 years after she was gone. I told her that was, as far as I could tell, the entire point of the job. She still calls me Dad. She never once needed a courtroom or a folder of evidence to know that. It took the rest of her family considerably longer. Zoe showed me her college application essay before she submitted it, which she didn't have to do, and which meant more to me than she probably intended. She'd written about the summer she learned to ride a bike in a church parking lot, about a man who never once needed the word real to know what he was to her, and about watching that same man stand up at a dinner table 18 months later and refuse to be erased. She didn't mention Preston by name. She didn't need to. The last line of the essay was simple. I learned that a family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up for the boring Tuesdays, year after year, without ever once asking to be thanked for it. I read it twice, standing in my kitchen, and had to sit down at the table for a while before I trusted myself to speak. I think, often, about that hallway, and those 2 mugs of chamomile tea going cold in my hands, and how close I came to simply absorbing that sentence the way I'd absorbed a decade of smaller ones before it. I think about what it means to build something, a bridge, a company, a family, and how the only real test of any structure isn't how it looks when everything's calm. It's what happens when the load gets heavy and someone starts asking whether you're really load-bearing or just decoration everyone got used to seeing there. This past Thanksgiving, the first one since everything came apart and slowly, carefully, came back together, we hosted at the Charleston house, the one still in my name, the one I built. Diane came early to help Claire in the kitchen, an arrangement that would have seemed unthinkable 2 years earlier. My mother flew down from Norfolk and spent most of the afternoon teaching Zoe her grandfather's recipe for cornbread dressing, the 2 of them elbow-deep in flour, laughing about something I couldn't hear from across the room. Harlan and his wife came, because by that point Harlan wasn't just my attorney, he was family in every way that actually mattered, and I made sure he knew it with a seat at the head of the table beside me. There was an empty chair, briefly, before Zoe's boyfriend arrived. One extra place setting nobody had accounted for, and Diane, without being asked, simply moved down a seat to make room, murmuring, "There's always room at this table for whoever needs it." And I caught Claire's eye across the room, and neither of us said anything, because we didn't need to. It was the exact opposite of the sentence that had started all of this, spoken now by the very woman who'd once made me feel like the extra piece in my own family, and something in my chest finally, fully, let go of a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I gave a toast before we ate, something I don't usually do, because I've never been a man who's comfortable holding a room's attention for its own sake. I kept it short. I said that I'd spent most of my life believing a man proves his worth by what he builds and how much weight it can carry without complaint, and that it had taken losing almost everything to learn the harder lesson, that the actual test isn't whether you can carry the load silently forever. It's whether you're willing to say, out loud, when the load has become too much, and trust the people who love you to help you carry it instead. Zoe reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Claire was crying a little, the good kind, the kind that doesn't need fixing. Even Diane dabbed carefully at the corner of her eye with a napkin, trying, and mostly failing, to pretend she hadn't been moved. I know now which one I am. I know now which one I always was. If you've ever been made to feel like the extra piece in your own family, the provider nobody thanked, the parent whose title got quietly put in scare quotes, I hope this reached you tonight. And I want to ask you honestly, if it were you standing in that hallway, holding 2 mugs of tea going cold, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have started making calls too?